So our next sequence, we're going to look in particular at Act 2, Scene 3 of King Lear, preparing for AQA's Paper 1 Tragedy paper of English Literature A-level. We're going to look at 2-3, which is Edgar's monologue. It's the first moment, it's his soliloquy here, where we begin to see Edgar as a real person and begin to realise how he might feature as a main character in the play, because he's had very little to say so far. I'm also going to do something that the exam board has done in the past, just once so far, where I'm going to cut across two scenes, because I'm going to go back to the final soliloquy in Act 2, Scene 2 as well, to extend that that's quite short scene into something that could come up as a passage to the whole. Now that's Kent with a kind of moment of reflection at the end of his angry scene in which he was put in the stocks. And it's an interesting echo between that and how Lear has gone from anger to something more like reflection in Act 1. And see all these parallels then between the scenes and the characters. And of course the parallel here is drawn strongly between the plot and the subplot. The good characters, the noble and just characters, are suffering here, and the strong characters are, safely ensconced in power inside their castles. So let's have a little look at the sequence. So if we start with Kent at the end of Act 2, Scene 2, he's left on his own. Gloucester shows some sympathy and he's left in the stocks, and it suggests that nighttime is turning into dawn, so the sun's coming up. And he makes a slightly obscure reference, he says, to the common saw, which is a common proverb or well-known saying, which is something, is generally Gloucester's been something similar to out of the frying pan into the fire, in that you go from bad to worse. But here it's a strangely upbeat version of that, in which it says, out of heaven's benediction to the warm sun. So suggesting you go from perfection to something that's good but not as good. So it's a strangely upbeat version, really, in the very negative situation that Kent finds himself in. Of course, it might be inspired by the arrival of the sun. And he's saying that the king is obviously going out into the sun and away from security of his land and his palaces and his castles, and then he speaks to the sun, approach thou beacon, and that I might look at this letter, and there's lots of letters flying back and forth. We've had that already, but here's one that we didn't know about. It says it comes from Cordelia. He says, nothing almost sees miracles but misery, which is an interestingly backward way of saying misery sees miracles, nothing else does. So in his misery, you can kind of hope for a miracle. The miracle might be that Cordelia has a plan to save the day, and she kind of does, in that she eventually comes back to fight the bad characters and reinstall Lear in power. So Cordelia somehow has been informed, it says, of his obscured course, and in seeking to give losses to their remedies. So it sounds like she has an idea that she wants to put things right. But he says, for now, I don't want to look at my shameful lodging, so I don't want to look at these stocks that I'm in, and therefore I'm going to close my eyes and go to sleep. Smile, fortune, once more turn thy wheel. And that's a key metaphor in the play, the wheel of fortune, which was meant to be the idea that you can be on the top of the wheel, you can be most successful at one point, but it's going to turn and you can end up at the bottom very quickly. So you find out when you reach the top, you're soon on the bottom. Is a kind of metaphor that runs throughout the whole play, that everybody's fortunes are constantly revolving. Here, Lear's and Kent's and Gloucester's, perhaps, although he doesn't know it, are all at quite a low state. They're going to get worse, perhaps, for Lear and Gloucester, but Kent probably had his lowest ebb here. He can't do anything to help anybody, but you might argue it's his own fault in that he had behaved intemperately and got himself put in the stocks when he didn't need to. But it's perhaps a measure generally of his despair and feeling hopeless, really, at this point, that he hasn't really found any way in which he can help his master significantly, because he knows that all the power lies in the hands of others. Now, that idea of him in shameful lodging and, this sort of a low ebb in the stocks is a neat lead into the state that we find Edgar in. So we'll see Kent looking sort of tired, shabby, broken man, really embarrassed, ashamed, reduced to the status of a criminal. And then we're going to see Edgar, who's going to put that sort of status onto himself because he's in such a state. So if we move into Edgar's section, which is the beginning of a new scene, what's key here is this is the first time Edgar's spoken more than a couple of lines together, really. And we need to see his personality come across. We need to contrast this, and it's always good to make links in order to reveal the essence of what we're looking at rather than to talk too much about elsewhere. But compare this to Edmund's great soliloquy at the beginning of his first big scene, Act 1, Scene 2, Thou, Nature, art my goddess. He flaunts his confidence and his charisma and his power. Here we see the sort of anxiety writ large, a sort of furious sort of terror, really, that's gripped Edgar. And it suggests, inner life there maybe of somebody who's been hiding away from the world and is suddenly now exposed to it. As much as Lear is going to be in the storm, you sort of see the real world out there, and it's frightening and horrible. And he's had to step out of his study and his books into the real world, and he's really not any idea how he's going to cope with that. The real world hates him. The real world wants to kill him, it seems, so he's got to disguise himself. Kent has disguised himself already, and he was our last character that we saw. Now Edgar, another good character, is forced into that. So everybody good is having to hide and disguise. Cordelia's run off or had to go away. Everything's at a low ebb and everything's going badly. The ones who are disguising themselves with success are people like Edmund, Goneril and Regan, who've lied and cheated their way into power and are about to, in the case of Goneril and Regan, to reach their zenith of power, really, when they manage to get Lear to storm off and leave them both the castles and lands to themselves. I heard myself proclaim then, so there's this idea that Shakespeare wants to emphasize that he's aware that he's been shouted, his name's been shouted as a criminal, basically, or proclaimed as somebody, an outlaw who needs to be arrested, and this terrifies him. The language is vigorous and energetic, with these alliterations, happy hollow of a tree, escape the hunt, a lot of H sounds there, which perhaps suggesting breathlessness of somebody breathing hard. And again, the plosives in no port is free, no place, a kind of bitterness and anger, a disgust, a sort of a spitting, maybe almost spitting out, again, in exhaustion. So one of the things that I think Shakespeare's really telling us with the way he writes this speech is that, remember, Edgar has run away. He's running from his enemies as he sees them, the people who are chasing him and want to get him and perhaps arrest him or even kill him. So the language has got that vigour of horror and fear, really. He says, I will preserve myself, which again has a certain power to it. I will preserve myself. It's a power that's quite a shadow of the power of Edmund's Now God Stand Up for Bastards. There's none of that confidence there, but it's about sort of a desperation to just keep alive. So it's a strength on a totally lower level of, I can do this. I've got enough strength to preserve myself, but that's about all I can hope for. And then he talks about base, which is interesting because that's exactly the same word that Edmund used in his soliloquy, but Edmund used it ironically and bitterly. Why base? Why bastard? He spat it out as being a ridiculous word. Here, he says, I'm going to take this base and poor shape that every penury and contempt of man brought near to beast. So I'm going to take on a role of something low and animal-like. And the whole play asks that question, and it asks it very vigorously in Act 3 in particular. What's the difference between a man and an animal? The poor, bare-forked animal that Lear's going to talk about. And the difference between a man and an animal is the luxuries of clothing and shelter and culture and the way of life of human beings is much easier than beasts. He's going to reduce himself down to the sheer basics of survival. And that seems to be what Edgar represents in the play at this time. What happens to a person when you take everything away from them and become just an animal trying to survive? The horror of that. Again, the language is full of this figure. We've got quite a lot of alliteration. We've got strong words like base and contempt and beast, and then griming with filth and not. So the language, like all the plays, full of a vigorous kind of conflicting and tangled and thorny feel to it. He's going to present nakedness, and he says, outface the winds and the persecutions of the sky. He's going to cry out to the sky, sort of thing. Now, that's, of course, again, a strange pre-echo of exactly what Lear is going to do in Act 3. So what Edgar's going to take on and pretend to do, Lear is going to do for real, if you like. Edgar's going to pretend to be a madman, but it's a pretense. Lear has probably lost his sanity by the time he reaches the storm in Act 3. And then he talks about, well, I've got some evidence of this. I've seen these Bedlam beggars. Bedlam being the Bethlehem Hospital in London, that was the place where people with mental health problems, lunatics as they were called at the time, were placed. And more like a prison, really, than any kind of health institution. And again, the vigour of the language, he says, he decides to describe these people, and he says that you see these people when they turned out of the hospital, or escaped from it perhaps, that their roaring voices can be heard in and around the towns and villages, and that they do awful things to themselves. They're seen sticking sort of pins into themselves and harming themselves, this self-harm that we think maybe was a 20th century concept. You know, this was something that people with mental health problems did back then too, in a sort of, in their despair, and perhaps in a way of taking control in some way of the pain, or as we'll see in Act 3, it's mentioned by Lear, perhaps causing physical pain to try and distract yourself from the mental pain that you're in. And then he talks about these low farms and pelting villages, sheepcots, mills. So these sort of rather kind of run-down places that you'll see these beggars hanging around. And again, the word lunatic comes in, shouting bans, some kind of spell or invocation and prayers. And then they enforce their charity. They beg for charity. They make people. So poor Turligod is the sort of thing they would shout, poor Tom. And he becomes that character, poor Tom. It seems like that was a kind of stock name for a beggar at that time. And the last line is really interesting. That's something yet, Edgar, I nothing at. So he's kind of saying, well, there's something at least. I haven't got anything left, but at least I can be this. And there's many, many interpretations to that line, really. But he seems to be saying, at least I've got that. At least I've got this mental strength and imagination to pretend to be something I'm not. At least I've got a protection against the attack that might come on me by pretending to be somebody else. I'm safe from being arrested as Edgar. Edgar I nothing am is, obviously an odd word order, and that word nothing again singing out as it has done throughout the whole play. Cordelia had said nothing will come from nothing. Well, we know that a lot has come from nothing. Again, he very clearly emphasises here, as Shakespeare, that this is what the play's about, reducing something to nothing, taking everything away. What happens when we rob our culture of all kinds of value and luxury and hope? What happens to human beings when we reduce them down to this kind of mess of bestial struggle for survival? It's perhaps suggesting that there's some kind of what might be called cathartic, which is a great tragedy word, of course. It might be some cathartic process going on for Edgar, that he's harbouring some inner torment that is never really highlighted in the plays. Although we might ask, what happened to Mrs. Lear? What happened to King Lear's wife? Because she's never mentioned or, discussed. But, maybe there's some story there about the loss of the mother figure. But whatever it is, Edgar has within him this kind of screaming fury that he needs to release, and that he does it by pretending to be poor Tom, and that is a process of rebuilding his humanity. Maybe it's something perhaps he needed to go through too, to step out of his coziness into something more sort of shaking and troubling too, but also just to release these pent-up feelings that perhaps he's been holding in for many years. And that process, is echoed in what happens to King Lear too, in that both of them have to kind of be reduced before they can sort of see their status and their reality and see what matters in life. And Edgar takes a long time to really get to grips with that, and you might argue that he never fully gains the awareness that he ought, that he ends the play overly confident that everything has been sorted when it hasn't, and keeps trying to sort of say, well, there we go, I've sorted everything out, everything's good now, justice has prevailed. Most of us watching it don't really share his confidence, I don't think. So it's arguable that Edgar's process of being torn through a terrible experience to perhaps become a richer and more interesting person doesn't really work. And he ends up becoming just rather much the same as he ever was. But here there's some vigour to him at last. It's a kind of defeated and troubled vigour, but it's something a bit more than just the kind of gaping wonder and easily gullibly being pushed around that we've seen before. So again, the play is full of a sense of chaos. If we've the Fool with his riddles, Lear with his raving, Kent with his anger, the bitterness and fury of Edmund, are all creating a sense of chaos and viciousness and violence. And here now we're going to have another layer of that, and particularly once we see his act as poor Tom, the kind of furious outpouring of noise and strange imagery seems to be a part of the general sense that the whole of the world has descended into chaos, and nobody is safe within this environment at all. It's a very dangerous world King Lear describes.